Welcome to this Mtech Access webinar. At Mtech Access, we provide health economics and outcomes research and market access services from strategy through to implementation. Get in touch today to discuss your market access goals. First though, I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to our Global Whispers webinar. This is the third in our new series, so please see our YouTube channel for past webinars and look out for more content from us in the future. The topic today is market access in the German-speaking markets. I'm Clare Foy, Director of Global Market Access at Mtech Access. We have a great mix of audience today, from industry to healthcare systems, and I'd like to particularly welcome our global affiliate partners. They play a key role in the work that we do, and we're very grateful for them. For those that don't know us very well, Mtech Access is a global specialist health economics, outcomes and market access consultancy. We have a track record in expert delivery, and we provide specialist support to pharmaceutical and medtech clients. We work as a collaborative partner to healthcare systems worldwide. Today, we're focusing on the market access challenges in Germany, Austria and Switzerland, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Stefan Walzer, CEO, President and Founder at Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy. Welcome, Stefan, and thanks for joining today. Could you please take a moment to introduce yourself and your current role?
Of course, thanks, Claire, for the introduction. Thanks also for the invitation. I'm working in the field of market access, reimbursement, pricing since now roughly 20 years. And on the German-speaking component of it, probably also already a bit more than 15 years. So I started already quite early when I was still in the industry. I had experience in the industry, I had experience in consultancy, and I have founded Mars and a couple of other companies basically 11 years ago. And as you already said, we're focusing with Mars on Germany, Switzerland, and Austria.
Perfect, thank you. So your area of expertise is market access in those German-speaking markets. We're going to go into depth in each of those markets, but could you first give us a really brief outline of the nature and the differences between those three markets in terms of stakeholders and reimbursement processes?
Yes, and it's probably the kind of question of being brief, right?
No, we could talk forever.
Yeah, no worries. No, I mean, to start with, right? I mean, if you have a kind of probably a kind of helicopter view on the countries, I think the first thing what you would recognize, and I think you named as well the webinar, is German speaking, right? But I mean, at the end of the day, I think if you would ask a Swiss person if they speak German, they will probably say, no, we speak Swiss German, right? So it starts already, you know, with those kind of little nuances, which is also obviously very important, also from a cultural perspective, right? I think Germans, Swiss, Austrians are also just from their general, let's say, personality, still different, as obviously Northern Germans are different to Southern Germans, as probably in every kind of country. I think that's just something important as well, keeping in mind, especially when you would really consider going into those countries from a, let's say, commercial launch perspective, but also from a negotiation perspective, where obviously reimbursement fits into. So I start already a bit with the end, right? I think if you basically move a bit forward to the beginning for reimbursement, which is obviously the kind of submissions and quite clearly the kind of different bodies which are handling those, ultimately, what is very similar between the three countries is that there is a kind of benefit assessment and a kind of negotiation from a price/cost perspective, and no real health economics is required. Even though that you have, let's say, the opportunity to submit, I would rather say in Switzerland, and you would have one or the other kind of direction in Austria, where you would also need to have a health economic component. And if you speak with some different Austrians who probably had already, let's say, the experience 15, 20, 25 years ago, they would probably rather say that Austrians invented that whole kind of HTA, even before the British. That was a quite interesting debate I had with one of the experts a couple of years ago. So at the end of the day, there are some similarities, but obviously they are quite different as well when you go into the details.
Okay, thank you. I think you did well there to summarise quickly. Let's start with Switzerland. So we know it's a slightly unusual European market, obviously outside the EU, and it has its own regulatory body for that reason, Swissmedic. As far as I understand, it doesn't have its own HTA body, but they outsource HTAs and oversee them by the FOPH. And I think, unlike some other European markets, healthcare is mostly funded by private insurance. So it's often a market that pharma companies are interested to know about and what the advantages are of launching into Switzerland. So perhaps you could start by talking a little about the landscape in Switzerland and how those factors influence its attractiveness to pharma.
Yeah, I guess attractiveness to pharma should probably not be linked to, let's say, development and having maybe headquarters or other kind of functions within Switzerland. I think that's probably another issue and has probably a lot to do with, let's say, the flexibility from a tax perspective. But I guess if we maybe move a bit back towards, I mean, the area we're discussing, reimbursement, market access, I think it's probably two components which are important as well, keeping in mind. I mean, especially if you have a drug, you would obviously need to, I mean, firstly go through the regulatory body Swissmedic. You have just said that as well, which is, I would guess, also a bit of a hurdle, because obviously you have the big FDA for the big US, then you have the EMA, which is covering basically the European Union, and it's already a bit of a hassle with UK now, right? After Brexit. So, but even though, I mean, if you compare, let's say, Switzerland to the UK is just much bigger, right, from a population's perspective. So that is where it's getting a bit tricky sometimes from a drugs perspective. And the other point, and I'm just coming back to that in a minute, the other point is basically that a lot of people still think that Switzerland is, in general, a high-price country, right? There's a lot of high prices in probably in any kind of area. But from a pricing perspective of drugs, I would rather say I would guess rather belong maybe somewhere in the middle of all of the different countries. So they're clearly not on top of the country. So that's just something keeping in mind, where we need to explain a lot of times still, let's say, people firstly approaching Switzerland. I think anyway, I think, as already said, I mean, those two components might be maybe seen a bit negative in a way, but I think what is probably very important, which is quite, I would say, unique between the different countries, is that Switzerland has a kind of paid early access program, which would basically mean before a product is being available, so on label by Swissmedic, right? There could be, on a case-by-case basis, obviously, kind of requests being done to the different health insurances. And if there's a kind of, let's say, simplified benefit assessment, it's a kind of rating where you would basically need to, let's say, enter your different clinical trial results so far, and then you're basically coming up with a rating. It's a kind of school rating, and obviously the higher and the better you have, I mean, the more flexibility you might be in terms of direct discussions then from a price perspective with the individual health insurance fund. That works, I think, I would generally say quite good, quite well. I think there are some circumstances where you might have one or the other bigger debate with an insurance company, but it's at least, I would say, a kind of possible bridging solution. That's at least how the Federal Office of Health, so the FOPH, is basically hoping to see that. I mean, a couple of companies are only using that, especially if they have only very few patients in Switzerland. Anyhow, that's basically a bit of a bridge, and obviously if you would then approach still, let's say, the kind of reimbursement path, you would, or I would rather say, you have a bit more of pragmatic kind of dossier in front of you. So it's not the kind of very complex, complicated, big essay writing German stuff, typical German, right? Maybe it's a big country, that is why it's a big dossier, and then Switzerland's getting maybe 10% of it. I'm not sure, but I think if you compare it, I would rather say the Swiss dossier is a bit more pragmatic, right? On the point. You still need to cover everything, right? You need to start with the epidemiology, with the unmet need, you need to describe the mode of action, etc., and also the clinical trial data, for sure. And you still have as well a component in terms of pricing, and that's, I think, very important, because the Swiss besides the benefit assessment, what they basically do, they follow the kind of, let's say, 3 criteria. One component of it is basically two criteria already. One is the let's say efficacy. The other one is kind of efficiency. It's a bit difficult to, let's say, to probably translate into English. That's basically what they cover in there, where also unmet need is basically included, right? And then the maybe say the second component of those 3 requirements is then the economics, where they basically compare on one side, let's say the Swiss market. So are there any kind of comparators, any kind of products which are already available on the market, where it would say basically then include there. Sometimes it's a quite difficult kind of definition, right? On label, off label, other kind of labels may be included, combinations, first line, second line, whatever. It's sometimes a bit tricky, and that's obviously giving also a bit of room for negotiation for both sides. But that's the first component of the economics. And then the second one is obviously international reference pricing, where they will have a look on 7 countries actually, and which are then part of the basket. And for sure, they basically then take both together, and finally, you would ideally in that way have the final price. And on top, for those, let's say, for that kind of, let's say, internal kind of Swiss price comparison, there's also at least the option to add an innovation premium, meaning if there's really a kind of benefit, then they could also, let's say, agree on an up to 20% innovation premium to that price. And that's basically the kind of process, how it looks like. It's everything written, you submit the dossier, you get a reply back. I think within that kind of first cycle, the federal ministry has basically as well a dedicated committee, which is then discussing the case all together, right? So they basically have not only your product, they have a list of products, then when they come together, and that is basically then the kind of core, which is then getting into the reply, what you will then receive normally, let's say after 8 weeks from the BAG, and that's the start of the whole kind of, let's say, sometimes maybe more a kind of conversation in written. So it's a kind of negotiation in writing, right? On average, I would guess, with our average here, it's probably around 1.5 to 2 years for new innovative products. For, let's say, ingredients which are already available, which are maybe also not that pricey, it could be faster. Sometimes it could even obviously take longer. I think the first CAR-T, I think, took significantly longer, for example.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. With all those things in mind, I mean, it doesn't sound that unusual after all. So what considerations should companies make before they prepare for market access in Switzerland?
I guess also there's probably not a bit, yeah, probably not so many kind of surprises as you said as well. I think it's pretty much similar to a lot of other countries, right? I mean, obviously check, I mean, which kind of options are available, which kind of prices could potentially influence then also that kind of internal price assessment. Because I mean, as already said, I mean, sometimes you know, you could maybe try to push some products out there which might have an impact because of, I don't know, sometimes they are maybe used as third line. If you're a first line, you obviously want to focus maybe then on the first line products. So there is a bit of room of that kind of stuff. So that's an important component. For sure, you would as well need to have your clinicians, I have not yet mentioned those, obviously, let's say, in place. That is also why that potential bridge with that paid access, early paid access, is an important component. That, I mean, whenever the authorities obviously see and feel the demand, there's obviously always a bit of a bigger pressure. It's also important, for example, if the BAG, so the minister is basically seeing that there's no opportunity really to find an agreement over time. Sometimes they also basically request a hearing with the experts, right? Especially with the medical societies there, and that's then again very important that they can feel that there's at least a bit of experience and especially the demand there. So that's again something very important consideration. Again, not a big of a surprise, very similar to other countries. And the third one is, I think, also not a surprise. Quite clearly, having a look on a kind of let's say launch sequence, right? So which country should be launched firstly, and then obviously considering population is not that big in Switzerland. On the other hand, sometimes some countries, some companies have also used the country as a kind of, let's say, initial early commercialization, right? Because there is some cash coming in to the early paid access, sometimes linked with the German direct launch opportunity while the product is being assessed. So there is already, let's say, some some kind of income generated while the products have been assessed. So those are probably the kind of biggest considerations I would guess. I think otherwise, as you said as well, it's not such a big surprise. The only kind of bigger thing is still, I think everybody would probably need to move a bit away that Switzerland is, let's say, seen as a high-priced country, because that's just not the case for drugs, at least, I would guess.
Okay, that's very, very helpful, and I think you've busted a few myths there, which is really good. Let's move to Austria next. So I know they've got a new HTA body in Austria that took over in 2020. I think it's the LBI-HTA. So I was wondering, you know, what kind of an impact that's having, and what market access and pricing, the market access and pricing situation is like in Austria. Yeah,
it's also there. I think it's a good point there again. I think let's put it that way. In Austria, I think it's even more important to differentiate between the so-called inpatient and outpatient setting, which is also, and again, a bit different to what you, for example, have as a definition in Germany. I mean, whenever a patient is entering a hospital in Austria, that is basically seen as an inpatient. Why is that important? Because some products which are then administered in the inpatient, so meaning in the hospital, so if they're not oral, would not need to go through the, let's say, kind of regular reimbursement process, meaning that manufacturers could directly negotiate the purchase of the product with the individual hospitals. That's an important, let's say, first consideration, which is also important because whenever you have an EU label, so EMA approval, you could directly approach those hospitals. For all of the other kind of products, there is, again, a kind of, I mean, if you translate it directly, it's called the main association. It's a Hauptverband, the Dachverband, so it's the umbrella organization of the social insurance system, which is basically acting as the, let's say, the kind of assessment / decision body, right? So there you would need to, let's say, submit an even more, what is that now? Is it more pragmatic? I'm not exactly sure. It's more going into templates, right? Where you need, again, to enter it, but it's a bit more fragmented than the Swiss dossier. I think the Swiss one is still more a dossier. The Austrian is probably more a mix of the Swiss and the Germans, even though I know it that Austrians have, let's say, introduced that system much earlier than the Germans, for sure. And then I think within that kind of system, I think that's very important when you consider Austria. They only consider basically what is being publicly available. So it's what is published, right? So if there are some additional analysis out of the clinical trial, what you want basically to use as well, you should have it already published. I think I would say at least it should be already available as an abstract / as a poster presentation, especially if the trial is maybe just newly and freshly basically published. And obviously you need to have that kind of time gap for sure. But that's a very important consideration when you prepare, let's say, the paperwork for the submission. Then it's very important that basically you have 3 different boxes, right, where you could basically fall into. I mean, you have 2 different yellows, but ultimately it's one yellow box, which is basically, let's say, in the middle of the 2, let's say, more kind of systems. The yellow box basically means that you have still a physician basically who would basically need to still approve the product if it should and can be used with given kind of criteria. And the price is basically linked to the European average price. Austrians are basically taking all of the EU prices all into consideration, and they also take the freedom, for example, to request then an annual review as well, especially if there are not so many prices yet available in Europe. And that is, I think, where at least with that kind of status, most of the products are anyway just falling to the yellow box. The green box is more, I would guess, where there's not a lot of discussion and debate around the price. So it's most of the times not really suitable for new and innovative kind of products. And then you have obviously the kind of red box, which is, let's say, the kind of negative one. So meaning that basically no kind of reimbursement is possible. There are some exceptions, but I think that's probably too much for the webinar and the kind of overview for the 3 kind of countries, right? So that's a bit the kind of overview in a way, also for Austria. So in a way, it is similar because it also looks basically at the medical part. It has a bit of more also pharmacodynamic kind of questions, which is significantly more than what you see, for example, in Switzerland, also in Germany. So it's also important when let's say preparing the dossier, but ultimately it's also being driven quite clearly by the clinical benefit, published clinical benefits, and then it's also quite clear, also again not a surprise when you compare it to other countries, that Austrians are also requesting ideally the product being compared to the kind of current Austrian standard of care. And finally, there's, I mean, I said already, the EU average price, which might also then drive the whole kind of product.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you. Okay, let's turn to Germany now. I know that's the biggest of the 3 markets, often, you know, very highly attractive market for pharma. So let's start with just an overview of market access in Germany, and then I want to ask you a bit more about recent changes with the Financial Stabilisation Act.
Yes, sure. So I guess the focus, and that's probably very similar to the other 2 countries, is also again a bit more on drugs. In Germany, you have, I think that's, in the meantime, I think everybody knows the AMNOG process. So ultimately, I think the big benefit is still that at the time of, let's say, commercialization, the product is really available with the patient. A physician can use it, can prescribe it, and health insurances can pay, or need to pay, need to pay for the price a company is basically requesting, so the launch price. We're probably coming back in a couple of seconds until when they need to pay that price. At that time, the dossier needs to be submitted to the key decision maker in Germany, which is the Federal Joint Committee, the GmbH, complete and without kind of any missing kind of information. I think there was a big debate in the early days of the AMNOG. That's also why it's advised for companies that they do a completeness check 3 weeks before they submit the dossier, which is basically meant that they send the dossier as it is, as they would basically submit to the GBA at the time of launch. And the GBA is just checking that all of the boxes, all of the kind of parts of the dossier are being filled, even if it's just mentioned not applicable or whatever, right? They want to have everything German-like, right? Everything rightly written and everything basically filled out. That's the first part, right? So you enter basically into the German market, you can already generate your cash, which is also why it's even more important that you have your clinicians really backing you up, because obviously without the demand within the first 6 months, it's also then a bit difficult to argue, let's say in the second part of the process, when you are in the negotiation phase, to argue really that the demand, hence there was an unmet need, right? So that's always a bit tricky, can happen, and you can find sometimes some kind of arguments, but it's obviously getting then a bit more complex, right? So ultimately you would need to, let's say, divide the process in 2 components, right? One is the benefit assessment, which is only really focusing only on the clinical benefit. The GBA is comparing solely against their predefined German standard of care. So it's called the appropriate comparator. And if you don't have the evidence against that appropriate comparator, they simply say there's no added benefit, which is a bigger kind of, it was already a bigger kind of issue in the past, and it might get even bigger with the, I think you mentioned it already, with the update of the law, as I would probably rather say, but we're coming to that in a second. That first process is taken 6 months long, right? So it's 3 months kind of process for the evaluation, which is sometimes then being done by an independent, I think we can kind of independent. They call themselves independent, done by an HTA body, which is called IQWiC, which is, I would guess it's a bit like UK NICE. The only kind of difference is that they are not considering cost effectiveness or generally health economic kind of evidence. So it's really focusing on the clinical component, the calculation of the population, and obviously the kind of, let's say, demonstration of the cost components within the German system. The focus is pretty much not only against the appropriate comparator, but also, and that's probably even more important, probably similarly important, that they are only considering so-called patient-relevant endpoints. Swiss and Austrians, and probably also a lot of other agencies are, I would say, a lot more pragmatic on those kind of endpoints. I think the most prominent ones have been in the past, for example, HbA1c in diabetes, where the GBA is just saying that's not patient relevant. Patient relevant is only the complications, which are, let's say, the kind of consequences of the high HbA1c, like stroke, like myocardial infarction, etc. It's the same with the MMHG, for example, when you take blood pressure, right? A high blood pressure, yes, you can measure it, but if you measure it or not, a patient may be not feeling it. That's the kind of argumentation from the GBA's perspective, right? Hence, again, you're ending up with the kind of long-term complication issues like myocardial infarction, etc. So that's a very important consideration. That's obviously a lot of times a bigger kind of debate, for example, when you're, let's say, speaking with, let's say, companies not that experienced with the system in Germany. I think quite clearly, I think we have not mentioned that yet, but in Germany you can also obviously have an early consultation, so you can ask the GBA what they want to see. I think that's what you should obviously do a bit early. So that's the first 3 months, right? Assessment, the initial assessment, the early assessment is being then published. That's publicly available. Everybody can see how and what IQWiC/GBA is basically criticizing on your trial, on your demonstration of the trial, etc. Then there is the opportunity, at least, that the company and all of the other related kind of stakeholders, like physicians, like medical societies, but also competitors, for example, that they can as well submit a written statement. So I think the company is normally taking up all of the let's say critiques which have been raised by IQWiC/GBA, and that's a preparation then for the oral hearing, which is like the kind of let's say kind of hot debate with 4 of the members of the company, and then the full room with GBA members asking different questions. You will not get the questions beforehand, so you would need to prepare carefully and very much in detail on all of the kind of aspects within the dossier, and maybe even outside of the dossier, whatever they could think of, and then you have an hour to basically agree and discuss your case. I think that's probably another important component here again. Here also clinicians can take part, meaning that they could also participate if they have submitted, for example, written statement. And that's also why it's really important to have also the clinicians quite close, let's say, to the company, to the product, also to the experience of the product, because obviously, especially if they are clinical questions, those questions might, especially then being directly addressed to the clinicians who would take part in the oral hearing. So that's the first part of it, right? 6 months. That's now also where free pricing basically ends. So question is, okay, price was not yet negotiated, but I think the free pricing ends after month 6, which finally also means that obviously companies would need to have, let's say, need to take financial considerations for that, as whenever the price is finally agreed, there is then a payback into the German system starting in month 7. In month 7, then the price negotiation starts, which is a kind of new kind of stakeholder or player, right? The first one was the GBA. GBA part, let's say 50% of the members of GBA are members of the insurance system in Germany, and the insurance system is basically the head association of the public insurances in Germany, which are then driving and running the price negotiation. There are 4 rounds being set. I think what we have also seen in the past, that normally there are more than 4 rounds, 4 official rounds, where you have each time 4 hours where you discuss, right? You have the obviously the kind of prices from the other European countries which are taken into account. You are as well discussing your current sales numbers, which are then also being compared against the numbers what the insurances basically see. So that's always a bit of a gap, but you can most of the time you see and can explain that. And then obviously there's always the kind of debate how now to come up with a price, right? And that's where you know, the kind of arguments start. And ultimately, if there's no agreement between the two parties, normally after another 6 months, I think in the meantime it all takes a bit longer. One of the parties or both parties can basically call up the arbitration board, which have then another 3 months time to find a solution. And finally, then the company can decide to either withdraw the product or take the price as suggested by the arbitration board, or obviously earlier if there's an agreement. I think that's then quite clear that yeah, the new price is then being in effect afterwards. So that's a bit in a kind of nutshell.
No, that's great. And thank you for that overview. And I know, as you've said, Germany historically has been quite an attractive launch market. There's obviously a large population of people living in Germany, and the free pricing period has always been quite an attractive proposition. However, as you mentioned, some of that is starting to change. So could you give us an overview of the major changes now since the Financial Stabilisation Act and what's changing? And then once we've gone through the changes, we'll talk about what that means for pharma and, you know, what companies can do about it and perhaps what might come in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, good point. I mean, I think where most of the let's say related, yeah, maybe call it experts probably jumped on was, I think the bigger kind of change what was probably already expected a lot earlier is the threshold which has applied to orphan drugs. I have not yet mentioned that beforehand, right? If there is an orphan drug, you basically have a kind of, let's say, security net in terms of added benefits. So the GBA is automatically deciding that there is a positive added benefit for an orphan drug, even if there's basically no kind of evidence from an evidence-based medicine perspective. The question is then only that the GBA is deciding on the level of the added benefit, right? So is it non-quantifiable, maybe is it minor, or maybe is it even more, right? And they have defined that orphan drugs can, let's say, go through that kind of process, and it's basically, let's say, applicable in that way until they have reached an annual revenue of 50 million euros, 50. And that has been changed January 1st this year and it was lowered from 50 to 30 million euros. You know, I think at the end of the day, I think we have anyway seen already in the past that some orphan drugs have reached the 50 million, need to go again through the benefit assessment. I think there are probably not so many, significantly many more orphan drugs which would again need to go then through the benefit assessment. But still, it was reduced from 50 to 30. I think there were some other discussions to even lower it further, but finally it was the 30 million. I think that's at least what people have had, I think, primarily in mind. I think, to me, I think the bigger kind of impact are probably two other parts, both from a pricing perspective. I think one is the kind of pricing guardrails in a way, which are then now really directly linked to the added benefit. Before, I would rather say the added benefit was a positive added benefit was the entrance ticket to the negotiation, to negotiate upwards, right? To have a premium basically possible. Now it's really more linked to the added benefit rating. If there's no added benefit, it doesn't mean, like in other countries, that the product is not being reimbursed. That was never the case in Germany, right? This was always more the kind of question, which price could you really achieve, right? But if there's no added benefit now, it's basically said that the annual therapy costs cannot be higher than the appropriate comparative therapies if the market is a kind of generic market, and it needs even to be lower, 10% lower in comparison to the appropriate comparative therapy if it's a kind of patented, protected kind of market. I'm coming back to those kind of differentiation on the next couple of minutes. Question could arise, what if there's a kind of mixed market? We haven't seen it yet. It was just implemented. We are already going through some of the negotiations. I think the kind of negotiations we're currently a part of do not have a kind of mixed market yet. We're still discussing that a bit, but how that would really look like, I could imagine that we'll see quite soon one or the other arbitration board decision on that, how that could really, let's say, look like. I think I personally would rather say if there is at least one patented protected product available, it's no more a generic market. But obviously, you could imagine that the let's say insurance side, the public health insurance sides would see that totally different. I think we'll just see. I think currently this is just a way if it's let's say if there's no added benefit. If you have a non-quantifiable or a minor added benefit, where I think if you put both together, non-quantifiable / minor and no added benefit, you probably have already the vast majority of benefit assessment in Germany, which is I think what we might discuss again in a couple of minutes. But I think if you just focus on that non-quantifiable / minor added benefit, you would basically again have the kind of point, if there's a patented protected market available, you cannot have a higher price than the appropriate comparator therapy, which in some cases is okay, right? If there was already innovation being launched maybe a couple of months or even years beforehand, and the price is, let's say, quite acceptable to you, that might be fine. Obviously, if the last kind of product, but still patent protected, has been launching quite some years ago, the price might not be that attractive for the company itself. I think it's also important, I mean, when I say it is the price of the comparator, right? It's obviously the maximum. That's a maximum. For sure, the insurance companies and the negotiation leads there will for sure push that down. And they will always tell you, that's a maximum. Why should we pay that, right? It's just a kind of upwards kind of ceiling for that. If there's a generic market available, then we're again in the situation where we have been in until the end of last year, meaning kind of free negotiation, right? So find a solution, find the kind of argumentation, find an agreement between both parties. If you have more than a minor added benefit, so significant or a major kind of added benefit, then you're anyway, and again, free to negotiate a price according, let's say, to the rules of negotiations ultimately. But quite clearly, and that's, I think, very important, keep in mind, that's only a minority of products which really get such a kind of high added benefit level. So that's, I think, quite important, the kind of guardrails. And the other, it's even a third one, I've just not mentioned that before. I think the third important component is wastage. If there is more than 20% wastage on your product, on the package, on the most economic kind of package you have, then the system will basically charge you automatically a 20% discount to the price you have been requesting. And that's, again, it's you know, with tablets or, you know, sorry, with pills or so, I think it's maybe quite clear, right? You can count, right? I mean, I don't know, if you have 30 pills in a pack and you only need 20, I think, you know, you can easily do that calculation. If you have maybe different vials, maybe different cycles, etc., it's maybe not that easy. And then you're again back in an argumentation, right, between the two parties. But that's already, you know, it's a kind of it's summing up a lot of different components already, right, which can have a kind of quite important and major impact on future pricing of products in Germany. And we haven't mentioned a couple of other things which have, again, and also been introduced, like the price volume agreement. But maybe I stop here firstly.
No, that's great. Before we move on to the price volume agreement, perhaps you could talk about the pricing guardrails and the cap on revenue for orphan drugs, and what that means in Germany. I know there's been some commentary from pharmaceutical companies about this, and you know, some very dramatic headlines talking about the death of innovation in Germany and so on. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the kind of lowering of the threshold for orphan drugs, I don't see that as so dramatic, to be honest. I mean, yes, of course, we need to be quite careful. I mean, what if you have, let's say, a CAR T cell therapy which might really save lives, and for only very few patients where you maybe need to charge ultimately in a way maybe €1 million, and you have, you know, just imagine you have suddenly 32 patients and you just reached the 30 million, right? I mean, if you have only very few patients, very difficult to have then hard kind of evidence. But even there, I think you know, people are just saying real world evidence doesn't count for the GBA. It's not 100% true, right? Because especially for those ATMPs, the GBA can, and they are also already requesting registries where they just say, look, I mean, collect these or those kind of data in the next, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 years. There needs to be an agreement, you know, a protocol, whatever, and then we submit those kind of data for a final assessment. So there are, I think, at least with that respect, I think there are still some, let's say, considerations being made that also orphan drugs are also, and also in the long term, being made available in Germany. And I think that's also then the incentive to further have research and development in that kind of area globally, right? If people are speaking that, you know, research and development might be moved out of Germany, yeah, I mean, it's a nice message in the news, but ultimately, I think all of us basically know that research and development is not being done neither in Germany nor in some of the other kind of bigger countries. Yes, it's a bit, right? But ultimately, it's not done there. So ultimately, it's a global market, and big companies are basically moving their kind of research development where the kind of incentive and the benefits are highest. Anyway, it's important that we make those products finally available and with an attractive price. I think that's probably more the important consideration. That is why I think the kind of pricing guardrails, that could be probably a kind of bigger impact. I'm not really concerned about those kind of major and significant kind of added benefit. That's, let's say, business as usual, difficult or not difficult as usual. If there's a clear generic market, meaning if there has not been innovation in the last couple of years, and you have at least a minor or non-quantifiable added benefit, not a discussion, right? You have as well, again, the kind of flexibility. But what if you have one of those products where, I mean, we all know how hard it is to even get a minor added benefit with the GBA. So, you know, if you don't, let's say, bring that people basically back to life, it's very difficult to have one of the two highest kind of added benefits, right? So then you're ending up with a minor added benefit, which again was in the past a really good outcome. And then you might be really penalized if there are already one of the other kind of products available. Imagine if you're maybe a second or a third line kind of product, but in the overall market, maybe in first line, there have already been launches with maybe not so attractive kind of prices at the end of the day. But then you're still linked to those prices, maybe even lower, because the GKVSV, I mean, they are professional negotiators, right? They're just taking the third line kind of very cheap kind of product in there and just say, look, that's the overall market, but we only focus in here. I would do the same thing if I would be them, right? So I think you see, I think especially with that kind of, let's say, new regulation, I think the power has even been moved even further into the direction of the system. So if into the direction of the health insurance system, it's getting really, really now difficult to have a very attractive price in there. So I could imagine, and I have seen that when I started in the industry, the UK, England was still in the top 3 launch markets. And I think it has suddenly, let's say, disappeared from the top 5, at least in most of the companies with most of the products, even long before Brexit, right? That's now another debate. But, you know, you never know what will happen. Also with a kind of, let's say, country like Germany, right? Yes, we are 80 million people, but the UK had 60 million people, similarly big, right? So why should we not suddenly say, look, maybe Germany is not our first tier kind of country anymore, because France is maybe making a lot more progress, right? I mean, they're moving, what I see from outside, I'm not a French expert, but from outside, it looks that they're maybe moving a bit more into a direction to be a bit more innovative friendly in a way, right? I mean, we have seen the changes in Italy, right, with the innovation kind of premium sometimes, right? They have been as well quite fast in the recent negotiations, if there's innovation. Obviously, we could also say, yes, if there's innovation, we still have the same holding true in Germany, right? But a key question is really what and how many of those products will still have non-quantifiable / minor added benefit, and what price we could really achieve for those one where there is a patented protected mark. I think that's the biggest kind of hassle, I would guess, in the next couple of months.
Thank you. Yeah, and on this topic now of the price negotiation, so it's not just the negotiation regarding the reimbursed price, it's also, as you said, a price volume agreement. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, let's put it that way, right? It's just another component. I mean, you know, if you now start obviously with the negotiation, you know that this needs now to be negotiated, right? Before it was a kind of common regulation, right? So both parties could, let's say, agree on it. But I think in most of the cases, I mean, neither party was really, let's say, pushing to that kind of direction. There are some exemptions, but now you need to negotiate it, meaning you would have the kind of, let's say, general discount discussions plus maybe a price volume discussion as well. The only kind of, at least currently, I mean, again, we're in the early stages, so we're just now running with the first products across the industry through that kind of process. So currently it at least looks that price volume agreements could be, let's say, agreed quite flexibly still, meaning that you could you know, think of having maybe a 12-month kind of rolling system. You could maybe have it more on a fixed kind of, let's say, assessment period. You could have it a kind of one-off. You could have different thresholds in there, right? I mean, if you have 10,000 of patients, you could maybe say, look, I mean, we have a first threshold after 2,000, then after 5, and then after, I don't know, 7,500. Depends a bit how you want to move that forward. I would say if you use it smartly, you could probably also see an opportunity in it, because you could link it with your kind of let's say, general kind of discount or rebate discussion. I think in the past, I think the negotiators normally just push that back. It's too difficult to keep track. It's too difficult for us from an administrative perspective. Now they need to do it. So there's no way out, and meaning that, you know, if you have, I mean, if you could explain why such a kind of system you're proposing is making sense, then they could potentially also come up with that, maybe even as a kind of key solution for the price negotiation. That's maybe also, you know, if you think it smartly, you could maybe also use that together with the guardrails, right, in order to come up with that kind of, or let's say, with those kind of different outcome parameters. I think very important, before I forget it, I think it's not about a confidential discount then, right? So the price volume agreement itself, so the overall agreement is obviously confidential, but the price volume agreement basically means, that's at least what we have seen and heard so far from the health insurance side, is that they want to have, and that's a clear mandate, that there is a given publicly available additional discount. Meaning, if you take that 2,500, 5,000, 7,500 kind of example, if you hit the first threshold with 2,500, there's an additional benefit. Sorry, not a benefit. It's an additional price cut, which is also publicly then available, meaning the list price needs to go down. So everybody's seeing that, right? And then the second one, then after 5,000, the third one, for example, after 7,500. So nothing confidential besides the deal itself, right? So people only recognize it when it really happens.
Thank you. That's a really good explanation. So with all these changes, how do you think that's going to impact on pharma companies? And also, what changes do you think we'll see in pricing strategy, global pricing strategy, accounting for these changes in Germany?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear that, let's say, price volume agreements will be seen a lot more often now, obviously in Germany, because it's a must. But ultimately, I mean, if people are just saying, but how should we? I mean, just have a look on France. I mean, they do that since centuries, right? And so I think that's quite clear. I think people will need to think even further about, let's say, the clinical trial design for sure. I mean, thinking about the right kind of endpoints, maybe also about the level of benefit what they can show. Maybe it's no more enough to maybe show in the primary endpoint a quite conservative difference between the two arms. Maybe they need to bump the sample size even further up, right, to see a bigger difference in a longer term. I don't know. It might cost more money, yes, but ultimately then still the question. I mean, we cannot dream about the past, right? We need to see into the future, meaning the expected prices are just simply probably lower. And if we see a lower price, we need to think, how could we maybe still have an attractive price, let's say, in the future? And that can only, let's say, go currently either through a really interesting and creative kind of price volume agreement, but mostly basically through the kind of evidence package, meaning the kind of right clinical trial, which is then even more than again linked to the benefit assessment by the GBA. So that's very important. And on top of that, I would also say that besides the evidence base itself, I think it's even more important to work very closely together with German clinicians, also very early in the process, that they have the experience, because that might also have at least an impact on the discussion with the GBA, and might also show, for example, or maybe give a bit more, let's say, pressure, I would say, on both stakeholders when they negotiate to find an agreement. Because I think nobody finally wants to withdraw a product, because it's not good for anybody, not for the company, not for the system, and for sure not for the patients. So that's, I think, what we'll probably see even more. I mean, if Germany, as I already said a bit earlier, would really, let's say, no more be one of the key markets, I would currently still doubt it, because I think it's still too big. I think it's still, let's say, the opportunity to at least launch the product and keep it on the market, right? It's not a reimbursement yes/no decision. It's a price level discussion, right? But I guess, you know, what could obviously happen is if there might be suddenly maybe France even more attractive from a pricing perspective, maybe because it's more confidential, maybe some of the other countries as well, maybe that could have as well an impact. On the other hand, you could also, let's say, move that a bit around, right? And just say, you know, if you now take the kind of, let's say, quite conservative kind of systems, you add a lot of them now up there, right? So you have France, I would say quite similar to Germany. You have the UK, very difficult. Not thinking about all of the kind of smaller markets across Europe. So generally, I think Europe is really getting even more difficult. But I think what we see in the discussions, I'm again not a US expert, but what I see from outside of the US, it's also not getting easier there. So ultimately, I think it's a general question, right? How much of an incentive is still there for, let's say, the financial world, right, in order to invest in the pharmaceutical innovation? I think that's maybe a bit more of the question. I think everything else we need to see over time, if there might be real shifts between the different countries in terms of importances. I would guess for the moment, we need to see probably also how, especially those kind of, let's say, price guardrails will be really utilized, or if there's still a bit of more flexibility, because you have still confidentiality around the price agreement. So there's still some flexibility in there.
Yeah, I suppose time will tell. So do you foresee any sort of unintended or negative consequences of these changes? And with that in mind, what will the German government's view be on this? When will they want to review these changes, or, you know, what will they take into account as they perhaps think about the future and future changes in the country?
You know, I mean, if I, you know, if I read the different kind of news around the financial situation of the system in general, let's say that we have, let's say, debt for us. It's, I think the last number I saw was 17 billion across the 96 health insurances in Germany. I would rather think that that might even drive the ministry and the government probably to even have further kind of, let's say, changes within the system, but more again towards, or let's say, against the kind of attractive pricing for the pharmaceutical industry. I think we've just seen, I think yesterday there was also news that drug prices, spending on drug pricing prices is now on number 2 of all of the spendings across the healthcare in Germany, which I think before was always more on 3rd or maybe 4th, so after inpatient kind of cost. So that's obviously giving another kind of hint, you know, it's clearly too expensive. I mean, we have all heard the kind of communication. You could see that from 2 sides, right, around some of the quite newly launched products in the US with millions of euros of a price tag. What will that really, let's say, mean for launches across Europe? I mean, you could say that's transparency. On the other hand, it, I think, also increases, let's say, the fear for that, because I think all of the kind of little kind of orphan drug areas also add up to a bigger population. That's at least the viewpoint of the insurances, right? So I think currently I would rather say, I think what we have also seen in the past, I think if we have a kind of economic downturn, I think it's also getting very difficult for the healthcare industry in general. The other issue is, I think, quite clearly, and to be frank, I think if I have a look on the Minister of Health, I think he was never a friend of the pharmaceutical industry. You can read that through different kind of statements in the last, I don't know, 10, 15, 18 years. So that's, again, a bit of a difficulty, but how ultimately everything will really be impacted, you never know, right? Maybe we have suddenly a kind of a quite well year next year or the year after for the economics, for the economic side, and then suddenly we have more taxes coming in, and we don't have debts and still have a little bit more money available across Europe, and then you suddenly have a bit more still flexibility in the system. You don't know, right? Ultimately, I think if you have an innovation, I would guess there's still some money available. We have always seen that. I think it's more the kind of question, what will happen for all of those products where we would say it's not the big breakthrough, right? It's maybe a stepwise innovation. And what about those products where you have just simply thousands of patients, right? Just because there are thousands of patients doesn't really mean that those patients should not be served, right? Yes, it's a big budget impact, but ultimately you also want to have innovation for those patients, right? So that's, I think, a bit of the tricky component of the whole kind of environment, but that's probably not dedicated only for Germany. I think, again, Germany is important, I think, for Europe, but I think ultimately it's the whole continent. I mean, 80 million in Germany, 60 or 65 in France, 60 million in the UK. I think if you add on all of those kind of different countries with a similar kind of push, it just shows that it's getting generally more difficult across Europe, which doesn't mean that it's no more attractive if you compare it to other countries across the world, but it's just getting more difficult.
Absolutely, yeah, and as always, it's a difficult balance between innovation and companies spending their money and investing in finding new innovations and also serving patients, but also balancing that with affordability. It's a very difficult question, and we're seeing health systems struggle with that around the world, as you say. So yeah, I think that's been really great. Thank you ever so much for your time. I think we could go on longer, but we only have an hour. So yeah, thank you. I think it's been very, very useful. Hopefully the audience found it useful too. I did try to weave in some of the questions as we went, but if there's anything that anyone wanted to ask, please get in touch after the webinar and we can follow up. Just looking to the future, we have a couple more webinars already in the diary, so look out for those. We've got our topic next month is going to be AI in clinical trials and the implications for market access, so that should be quite an interesting one. And then in October, we're going to speak to an Italian expert, and Stefan, you didn't know about it, but thank you for talking about one of the topical issues in Italy around innovation. So I think those will both be really interesting. So we hope to see you again in future webinars, and thanks everyone for your time.
Thank you for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our work or how we could support your market access goals, please email info@mtechaccess.co.uk or visit our website at mtechaccess.co.uk.